My dad suspended me until I apologized to my sister and I just said fine. And the next morning she was smirking until she saw my empty desk and my resignation letter. And yeah, hey Reddit. My dad suspended me without pay for 2 weeks because I undermined my sister's authority at the family company. I didn't beg or argue. I just said fine and walked out. And the next morning my sister was still smirking until she saw my empty office and that letter. And 3 months later they were begging me to come back, but by then the entire company was already collapsing. So here's how it went down. I'm Jordan, 32 male, and I spent 6 years as project director at Sterling Development Corporation in Chicago. Not an entry-level role, but the head of the entire architectural division. Every major money-making project over the last half-decade was my work. From the sustainable housing development that won 3 industry awards to the modular construction system that cut build time by 40%. All mine. I started at Sterling right after graduating at 26, making $58,000 as a junior architect. And in my first year I redesigned a failing residential project in Naperville that saved the company $340,000 and earned me a promotion to senior architect. By year 3 I was project director, making $94,000 plus bonuses and managing 12 architects and engineers. And by year 5 my division generated 68% of the company's revenue. Roughly $59 million out of $87 million annually, and my office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, not because I was born into it, but because I earned it through 80-hour weeks and turning impossible deadlines into finished buildings. The walls displayed my architectural degree from Illinois, my structural engineering certification, and 5 industry awards, with one wall covered in photos of completed projects like the Riverside Eco Complex, the Morrison Tech Campus that won the 2022 Green Building Award, and the Lakeshore luxury residences featured in Chicago Magazine, while another wall showed prototypes of innovations I developed, including the Echo Frame system, thermal regulation panels, and a modular foundation system, because I had built something real there, a team that respected the work, a portfolio that proved sustainable luxury wasn't just marketing, and a reputation that opened doors. Yet my dad Patrick, the CEO and founder, treated all of it like it belonged to him by default since Sterling Development is a family business he started 30 years ago, doing small suburban residential projects and grew into luxury eco-homes for tech executives and custom commercial buildings for corporations with too much money. Pulling around $87 million in revenue last year, even though based on our pipeline we should have been clearing $120 million. And the difference was my sister Vanessa, 29 female, the vice president of client relations. A title she got at 25 with 0 industry experience, holding a communications degree from a mid-tier private school that cost Patrick $180,000. A woman who has never designed a building, managed a construction crew, done a structural load analysis, or reviewed a permit application, but who can smile at rich people and promise things that are physically impossible. And it started her first month when she promised a client in Wilmette a custom edition in 6 weeks during a Chicago winter when concrete won't cure below 40 degrees, forcing me to personally negotiate with the client, explain the physics, and extend the timeline to 4 months while the client was angry but understood and Vanessa kept her commission. Then there was the Oak Park project where she lowballed the estimate by $340,000 by forgetting to account for custom Italian marble. And I had to find savings, negotiate supplier rates I'd built over 6 years, and bring it in only $80,000 over her original number while Patrick praised her for landing such a profitable deal. And my favorite was the Evanston disaster where she promised we could build on an unsurveyed lot that turned out to be protected wetland, making construction illegal without major mitigation, leaving me to spend 3 months with environmental consultants and city officials redesigning the project for an adjacent lot while the client threatened to sue before finally agreeing. And when I raised the issue, Vanessa just said, "That's why we have you to handle the details." Because for years I covered for her. While she promised 90-day builds that I delivered in 120, slashed budgets by 30% that I quietly fixed, forgot permits that I smoothed over with inspectors, and the unspoken rule was always the same. Vanessa brought in clients with her sales pitches, Nordstrom designer outfits, and charm, and I carried the weight that kept the company standing. I delivered the actual buildings that didn't collapse or violate building codes while Patrick got to play the proud father to both his children as the money rolled in. Vanessa's annual commission checks averaging $280,000 while my salary stayed at $94,000 plus a $12,000 annual bonus if projects came in under budget, which they always did because I was good at my job. And Patrick loved this arrangement because he'd introduced Vanessa at industry events as the face of Sterling Development's future. and then gestured to me as the technical expert who makes it all possible. Not his son who built the company's modern reputation, but just the technical expert. Like an appliance that came with the building, and the unspoken rule was simple. Vanessa got the credit and the commissions while I got a salary and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the buildings wouldn't collapse. And I told myself it was fine, that I was learning, building a reputation, waiting for the right moment to start my own firm. The usual lies people tell themselves when they're being exploited by family, until 3 days ago when Vanessa closed a deal that finally pushed me past my breaking point. A tech executive from Silicon Valley who made a fortune in cryptocurrency and wanted a $20 million lakefront mansion to redefine sustainable luxury and land him in Architectural Digest. Fine. We'd done projects like that before, but Vanessa took the meeting without me, which should have been my first warning sign. And she came back with a signed contract and a smile that screamed trouble, announcing closed the deal as she walked into the Monday morning executive meeting like she'd won the lottery. A $20 million project with a 12% commission and clients ready to break ground next month. Patrick beaming at her and calling it excellent work, sweetheart, and exactly the kind of high-profile project we needed, while I sat reviewing quarterly budget projections and only half listening until Vanessa slid the contract across the table and told me I'd want to look at the timeline because the clients were very excited to move in before winter. And when I picked it up and saw the completion date set 90 days from permit approval, my stomach dropped. I said it had to be a mistake, keeping my voice calm. But her smile didn't waver as she said it was no mistake and she promised move-in ready by October 15th because that's what it took to close the deal. And I explained this was a custom 8,000 square foot home with advanced environmental systems, that the foundation alone needed 4 weeks to cure. The custom glass panels had a 12-week lead time, and permits would take at least 8 weeks, only for her to wave me off and say that's why we have you. You always figure it out. And I looked at Patrick waiting for him to see reason, but he just watched me with that expectant look like I was about to solve a math problem he already knew the answer to. And when I told him it was physically impossible and even cutting corners wouldn't help because of building codes and that 9 months was the minimum, he said he'd heard impossible from me before and yet somehow the buildings always got finished. And I told him this wasn't a miracle but fraud and that promising 90 days and delivering 9 months would end in a lawsuit. While Vanessa leaned back examining her nails and suggested maybe if I spent less time making excuses and more time managing my team we wouldn't have this problem. And that's when I made my decision, not emotionally because I was past that but strategically, pulling out my laptop and spending the next 2 hours building a realistic construction timeline with every task, dependency, and resource allocation detailed, adding buffer time for weather and materials, running the critical path analysis 3 times until it was airtight, ending with 267 days from permit approval to certificate of occupancy, almost 9 months, compiling it into a professional report with photos of similar projects, contractor testimonials about lead times, and citations of Illinois building codes governing curing times and inspections, making it impossible to argue with, then emailing it to the client and copying Vanessa and Patrick with a simple message thanking Mr. Chen for choosing Sterling Development and providing a realistic timeline to ensure quality and compliance, hitting send at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and by 7:15 Vanessa was screaming outside my office, bursting in without knocking while I reviewed another project's structural calculations, demanding to know what the hell I'd just done. And I calmly told her I sent the client an accurate timeline because it's called professional integrity, only for her to accuse me of torpedoing her deal and say he was threatening to pull out. And I told her he should because we couldn't deliver what she promised and pretending otherwise would end in a lawsuit costing more than her commission, which made her slam her hand on my desk and remind me she was the VP of Client Relations and I shouldn't contact her clients, and I reminded her I was the project director who actually had to build these projects, and when she promised the impossible it became my problem and I was solving it. And then she pulled out her phone, fingers flying, and within 2 minutes Patrick called my office line and told me, "Jordan, my office now." I saved my work, closed my laptop, and walked down the hall to the executive suite where Vanessa was already waiting, sitting in the leather chair across from Patrick's desk with her arms crossed and that smug expression on her face, while Patrick sat behind the desk with his hands folded, looking at me the way he used to when I was a teenager who'd just gotten caught shoplifting. And he said, "Vanessa tells me you went over her head with a client without authorization," and I replied that I provided accurate project information to prevent a breach of contract lawsuit, which made him snap back that I undermined my sister's authority, and I said I prevented us from committing fraud, his jaw tightening as he said we don't use that word in this office. So I asked then, what word would you prefer? Misrepresentation, false promises, negligent misstatement. And that's when Vanessa jumped in with her voice dripping in fake concern, telling me, "Jordan, I know you're stressed and you've been working so hard, but you can't just email clients whenever you feel like it because there's a chain of command." And I answered that the chain of command doesn't override the laws of physics, which made Patrick stand up in that power move he always used when he wanted to intimidate people and say, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Mr. Chen and apologize. You're going to tell him you were overly cautious and that we can absolutely deliver on the timeline Vanessa promised." And when I said I'm not going to lie to a client, he told me, "Then you're suspended 2 weeks without pay, and when you come back you'll apologize to your sister for this insubordination." And the room went quiet while Vanessa tried not to smile, and I looked at Patrick, really looked at him, and finally saw what I'd been avoiding for 6 years. That he didn't see me as his son but as a resource, a machine that produced buildings and solved problems. And when the machine questioned its programming, it got shut down for maintenance. So I just said fine. Not yes sir or I understand or anything he expected, just one word, fine. And the way his face changed told me he understood exactly what I meant. That this wasn't submission but acceptance. That I was accepting we had fundamentally different values and trying to change his mind was a waste of my time. So I walked out of his office without another word, went back to my office that had been my sanctuary for 6 years, where everything represented something I'd built or earned, the Illinois degree I paid for myself, the structural engineering certification I studied for while working 60-hour weeks, the awards from the Illinois Architecture Foundation, the photos of my team celebrating finished projects, a career, a reputation, a standard of excellence Sterling Development never had before I joined. And now I was going to dismantle all of it, closing the door without locking it, pulling 3 cardboard boxes from the supply closet and packing systematically, taking down the degrees first and wrapping them in bubble wrap, not with nostalgia but with the efficiency of someone archiving evidence. Then the awards, then the project photos and prototypes of structural systems I designed. When my assistant Amy knocked and peeked in looking terrified because the rumor mill moves faster than email, asking if I was okay and saying she heard I was taking a leave, and I told her to go home for the day, that she'd still get paid but I needed her out of the office. And when she mentioned a presentation I cut her off and said it doesn't matter anymore, just go home. And she stood there confused for a moment before nodding and leaving. Smart girl who'd figure it out soon enough. And as I packed I kept coming back to one item, the prototype of the Sterling Signature Echo Frame, the crown jewel modular sustainable load-bearing system that cut construction time by 40% and increased energy efficiency by 50%. The thing that took me 2 years to design, test, and perfect through hundreds of hours of calculations, dozens of failed prototypes, and meetings with structural engineers and material scientists. Something Patrick loved because it saved him millions and Vanessa loved because she could market it as revolutionary green tech. Neither of them knowing I'd filed the patents in my own name, because that's what you learn working in a family business, to protect yourself, since my first year at Sterling. The custom glass panels had a 12-week lead time, and permits would take at least 8 weeks. Only for her to wave me off and say, "That's why we have you. You always figure it out." And I looked at Patrick waiting for him to see reason, but he just watched me with that expectant look like I was about to solve a math problem he already knew the answer to. And when I told him it was physically impossible and even cutting corners wouldn't help because of building codes and that 9 months was the minimum, he said he'd heard impossible from me before and yet somehow the buildings always got finished. And I told him this wasn't a miracle but fraud and that promising 90 days and delivering 9 months would end in a lawsuit. While Vanessa leaned back examining her nails and suggested maybe if I spent less time making excuses and more time managing my team we wouldn't have this problem. And that's when I made my decision, not emotionally because I was past that but strategically, pulling out my laptop and spending the next 2 hours building a realistic construction timeline with every task, dependency, and resource allocation detailed, adding buffer time for weather and materials, running the critical path analysis 3 times until it was airtight, ending with 267 days from permit approval to certificate of occupancy, almost 9 months, compiling it into a professional report with photos of similar projects, contractor testimonials about lead times, and citations of Illinois building codes governing curing times and inspections, making it impossible to argue with, then emailing it to the client and copying Vanessa and Patrick with a simple message thanking Mr. Chen for choosing Sterling Development and providing a realistic timeline to ensure quality and compliance, hitting send at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and by 7:15 Vanessa was screaming outside my office, bursting in without knocking while I reviewed another project's structural calculations, demanding to know what the hell I'd just done. And I calmly told her I sent the client an accurate timeline because it's called professional integrity, only for her to accuse me of torpedoing her deal and say he was threatening to pull out. And I told her he should because we couldn't deliver what she promised and pretending otherwise would end in a lawsuit costing more than her commission, which made her slam her hand on my desk and remind me she was the VP of Client Relations and I shouldn't contact her clients, and I reminded her I was the project director who actually had to build these projects, and when she promised the impossible it became my problem and I was solving it. And then she pulled out her phone, fingers flying, and within 2 minutes Patrick called my office line and told me, "Jordan, my office now." I saved my work, closed my laptop, and walked down the hall to the executive suite where Vanessa was already waiting, sitting in the leather chair across from Patrick's desk with her arms crossed and that smug expression on her face, while Patrick sat behind the desk with his hands folded, looking at me the way he used to when I was a teenager who'd just gotten caught shoplifting. And he said, "Vanessa tells me you went over her head with a client without authorization," and I replied that I provided accurate project information to prevent a breach of contract lawsuit, which made him snap back that I undermined my sister's authority, and I said I prevented us from committing fraud, his jaw tightening as he said we don't use that word in this office. So I asked then, what word would you prefer? Misrepresentation, false promises, negligent misstatement, and that's when Vanessa jumped in with her voice dripping in fake concern, telling me, "Jordan, I know you're stressed and you've been working so hard, but you can't just email clients whenever you feel like it because there's a chain of command." And I answered that the chain of command doesn't override the laws of physics, which made Patrick stand up in that power move he always used when he wanted to intimidate people and say, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Mr. Chen and apologize. You're going to tell him you were overly cautious and that we can absolutely deliver on the timeline Vanessa promised." And when I said I'm not going to lie to a client, he told me, "Then you're suspended 2 weeks without pay, and when you come back you'll apologize to your sister for this insubordination." And the room went quiet while Vanessa tried not to smile, and I looked at Patrick, really looked at him, and finally saw what I'd been avoiding for 6 years, that he didn't see me as his son but as a resource, a machine that produced buildings and solved problems. And when the machine questioned its programming it got shut down for maintenance. So I just said fine, not yes sir or I understand or anything he expected, just one word, fine. And the way his face changed told me he understood exactly what I meant. That this wasn't submission but acceptance. That I was accepting we had fundamentally different values and trying to change his mind was a waste of my time. So I walked out of his office without another word, went back to my office that had been my sanctuary for 6 years where everything represented something I'd built or earned, the Illinois degree I paid for myself, the structural engineering certification I studied for while working 60-hour weeks, the awards from the Illinois Architecture Foundation, the photos of my team celebrating finished projects, a career, a reputation, a standard of excellence Sterling Development never had before I joined, and now I was going to dismantle all of it, closing the door without locking it, pulling 3 cardboard boxes from the supply closet and packing systematically, taking down the degrees first and wrapping them in bubble wrap, not with nostalgia but with the efficiency of someone archiving evidence. Then the awards, then the project photos and prototypes of structural systems I designed. When my assistant Amy knocked and peeked in looking terrified because the rumor mill moves faster than email, asking if I was okay and saying she heard I was taking a leave, and I told her to go home for the day, that she'd still get paid but I needed her out of the office, and when she mentioned a presentation I cut her off and said it doesn't matter anymore, just go home. And she stood there confused for a moment before nodding and leaving. Smart girl who'd figure it out soon enough. And as I packed I kept coming back to one item, the prototype of the Sterling Signature Echo Frame. The crown jewel modular sustainable load-bearing system that cut construction time by 40% and increased energy efficiency by 50%. The thing that took me 2 years to design, test, and perfect through hundreds of hours of calculations, dozens of failed prototypes, and meetings with structural engineers and material scientists. Something Patrick loved because it saved him millions and Vanessa loved because she could market it as revolutionary green tech. Neither of them knowing I'd filed the patents in my own name. Because that's what you learn working in a family business, to protect yourself. Since my first year at Sterling, I watched Patrick take credit for a senior architect named Douglas Chen's innovative foundation design that reduced settling in clay soil after Douglas spent 8 months perfecting and testing it on 3 projects and documenting every modification. Only for Patrick to present it at an industry conference as Sterling Development's breakthrough without mentioning Douglas once, leading Douglas to quit 3 months later and start his own firm while Patrick kept using the design without compensation or attribution. A lesson I learned immediately, documenting everything from my second year onward, every innovation, process improvement, and design modification in detailed lab books with dates, sketches, and calculations that hold up in patent applications. And by year 3 I met Patricia Kim, an intellectual property attorney who handled architectural patent cases, at an Illinois Architecture Foundation event where she handed me her card with a knowing smile and told me to document everything and consider filing provisional patents before showing anyone my work. A conversation that changed everything. I set up my own LLC, Sterling Innovations LLC, using the Sterling name intentionally to avoid suspicion, and it cost me $800 to file with Illinois, after which I started routing patent applications through the LLC instead of Sterling Development. Because the Echo frame system took 2 years to perfect, starting from a basic concept, what if load-bearing walls could be modular and manufactured off-site, and I spent weekends sketching designs, running simulations, calculating load distributions, and using my own money, about $14,000, to build prototypes and test them at a lab in Schaumburg, filing the provisional patent application in my 3rd year before I ever mentioned the system to Patrick, then spending another 9 months refining it through real-world testing before filing the full utility patent in year 4. So by the time Patrick saw the finished system and realized how much money it could make Sterling Development, the intellectual property was already locked down in my name. And I followed the same pattern for the thermal regulation panels, 18 months of development, $8,200 in testing costs paid out of my own pocket, patent filed before Patrick even knew it existed, and the modular foundation system, 11 months of work, $5,400 in materials and testing, patent secured, and over 6 years I filed 14 patents covering sustainable construction, modular building systems, and structural innovations, with a total cost of approximately $47,000 in legal fees, testing costs, and development expenses, all paid from my own salary, meticulously documented, completely legal. While Sterling Development had been built on my innovations for the past 6 years and Patrick and Vanessa had no idea they were effectively renting them from me under an implied license that could terminate at any time. And after taping up the boxes and stacking them by the door, the office looked sterile and generic, like I'd never been there at all. Which was exactly the point. Because Patrick wanted to teach me a lesson about hierarchy, wanted me to sit at home for 2 weeks thinking about my insubordination and then come back grateful for my paycheck and ready to apologize. But instead he handed me the perfect exit strategy. So I pulled out my laptop one last time, opened a blank document, typed 2 paragraphs, printed it on company letterhead, signed my name at the bottom, and left it in the center of my now empty desk where Vanessa would see it first thing in the morning, the resignation letter simple and direct, stating that effective immediately I was resigning from my position as project director at Sterling Development Corporation. That they should consider it my formal notice, that I would not be returning after my suspension period, that all active projects under my supervision would need to be reassigned, and thanking them for the opportunity to contribute to the company's growth over the past 6 years. Signed, best regards, Jordan Sterling. Without mentioning Vanessa, the impossible timeline, or my reasons, professional and clean, the kind of letter any lawyer would find reasonable later, and then I carried the boxes to my car, a 2015 Honda Civic with 143,000 miles that ran perfectly fine. Drove home to my modest 1-bedroom apartment in Lakeview that wasn't fancy but was paid for with money I earned and couldn't be taken from me. And that night I pulled out files I'd been organizing for the past 2 years. Patent documentation. For the Echo frame system, licensing agreements I drafted but never executed, contact information for competitors who had tried to recruit me over the years, and a business plan for my own architectural consultancy I'd written during slow weekends. Realizing I'd been preparing for this moment longer than I'd understood and that some part of me always knew it would end this way, and around 9 p.m. my phone started ringing, Vanessa, which I declined. Then she called back and I declined again. Then Patrick called, then Vanessa again. So I turned off my phone and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in months, waking the next morning at 6 a.m. out of habit, making coffee, going for a run along the lakefront, coming back to eat a real breakfast instead of inhaling a protein bar in traffic, and I didn't turn my phone back on until around 10 a.m. Just to see what happened, finding 47 missed calls, 32 text messages, and 15 voicemails, the texts moving from confusion to panic, Vanessa asking where I was because the client meeting was at 9, then saying this wasn't funny, then demanding I answer my phone, Patrick insisting we needed to discuss my resignation and calling it unacceptable before shifting to we can work this out. Amy texting that everyone was freaking out and asking what was happening. And the voicemails were even better, which I listened to while making a second cup of coffee. Patrick trying and failing to sound calm as he said we both said things in anger and the suspension was an overreaction and I should come back to the office. Vanessa not even hiding the panic as she said I couldn't just quit because I was managing 6 active projects and called it selfish. And finally Sterling Development's attorney, a guy named Harrison Webb, leaving a message saying they needed to discuss the transition of my ongoing projects and any potential contractual obligations and asking me to call at my earliest convenience. I deleted all of them without responding and instead opened my laptop and started making calls, real calls, to people who actually respected my work, and the first call went to Nathan Rodriguez, senior partner at Apex Architecture, someone I'd worked with on a joint project 2 years ago where Sterling Development handled the structural engineering and Apex did the design work. And Nathan had been trying to recruit me ever since. So when he answered with Jordan, didn't expect to hear from you. What's up? I told him I left Sterling Development and that I was starting my own consultancy focused on sustainable structural engineering and architectural innovation. And wanted to know if he'd be interested in contract work for some of his upcoming projects. And there was a long pause before he said, "You're serious? You actually left?" And I told him I walked out yesterday and that I had proprietary systems for modular construction and sustainable design that could cut project costs by 30% while improving efficiency. Asking if he was interested, and he immediately said hell yes. When can we meet? So we set up lunch for the next day, and 2 hours later, I had meetings scheduled with 4 other firms, and by the end of the week I had 3 signed contracts for consulting work at $200 per hour. More than I'd been making at Sterling Development once you factored in all the unpaid overtime. But that was just the beginning because the real move was the patents, so I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia who specialized in intellectual property law and whom I'd been working with for 2 years setting up the LLC and filing patents for every major innovation I'd developed, and I told her, "Patricia, it's time. I want to start licensing the Echo frame system to Sterling's competitors." And she asked if I was sure because once I did this there was no going back. And I said I was sure and told her to draft licensing agreements at market rate plus royalties and send a cease and desist to Sterling Development for any unauthorized use of my patented systems. And she warned me that was going to hurt them since they'd been using my designs as their flagship product, and I told her I knew and that was the point. And it took Sterling Development exactly 4 days to realize they were in serious trouble, with the first sign being the Highland Park Estates project, a luxury development of 8 custom homes halfway through construction, all using the Echo frame system, when the general contractor called me directly on day 3 and said, "Jordan, it's Mike Chen from Lakeside Construction. We've got a problem on the Highland Park project. The engineering team is asking about the Echo frame specifications and nobody at Sterling can explain how the load distribution works." And I told him that's because I designed it and I don't work there anymore. And he said they were saying they could finish without me, but the junior architect they assigned didn't understand the structural calculations and wanted to switch to traditional steel beams, which would double material costs and add 6 weeks to the timeline. And I said I knew and asked why he was calling, and he said, "Can we hire you directly as a consultant to finish the project?" So I quoted my consulting rate and he agreed immediately, and I drafted a contract clearly stating I was an independent consultant and not a Sterling Development employee. But 2 hours later Mike called me back sounding stressed and said, "Jordan, I just got a call from Patrick Sterling. He's threatening to sue me if I hire you for this project." And I asked on what grounds since I didn't work for him anymore and was a private consultant and Mike was a private contractor, meaning Patrick had no standing. But Mike said Patrick was claiming I was using proprietary company information, which almost made me laugh. So I told Mike I'd send documentation proving I owned the patents for the Echo frame system and that Sterling Development had been using my intellectual property under an implied license that terminated when I resigned, meaning if anyone was using proprietary information without authorization it was them. And there was a long silence before Mike said, "You're telling me Patrick doesn't own the design for his flagship product?" And I said, "Correct, I do, and I'm about to make that very clear." And that afternoon Patricia sent the cease and desist letter to Sterling Development via certified mail. A beautifully written letter that was clear, professional, and absolutely devastating, informing them that all patents for the Echo frame system were owned by my LLC, that my resignation terminated any implied license for their use, and that continued use without a formal licensing agreement constituted intellectual property theft. including a list of all active Sterling development projects currently using my patented systems along with documentation proving my ownership, and offering a licensing agreement at market rates of $50,000 per project plus 3% of project revenue in ongoing royalties. And Patrick called me within an hour of signing for the certified letter, but I let it go to voicemail, and his voice was different now, not angry but scared, saying, "Jordan, we need to talk about this cease and desist letter. This is absurd. You developed those systems while working for Sterling Development. The company owns that intellectual property." So I called Patricia and asked if I could respond, and she told me yes. Keep it professional, don't admit anything, don't make threats, just state facts. So I sent Patrick an email, not a call. An email so everything would be documented, stating, "Patrick, I developed the Echo Frame system and all associated innovations on my own time using my own resources. And all patents were filed through my personal LLC before any implementation at Sterling Development. You were operating under an implied license during my employment. That license terminated with my resignation, and if you wish to continue using the systems, we can discuss a formal licensing agreement. Alternatively, you can redesign your active projects using alternative systems. Best regards, Jordan." And his response came back in 4 minutes, all caps, saying, "This is extortion. I will not be blackmailed by my own son." And I didn't respond. I just forwarded the email to Patricia with a short note asking her to please document it for any future legal proceedings. And over the next 2 weeks I watched Sterling Development fall apart in slow motion through industry contacts who kept me updated. Starting with the Highland Park project stalling completely on day 6 when the junior architect Patrick hired a recent graduate named Kevin who'd worked for me for 8 months, tried to redesign the structural system using traditional methods and was completely over his head, because I'd trained him to follow my designs but not to create alternatives from scratch. And Mike Chen, the general contractor, sent me daily updates even though I never asked, saying on day 7 Kevin proposed using standard steel I-beams instead of the Echo frame. Material costs jumping from $340,000 to $680,000 with clients freaking out. Then on day 9 construction had to halt because Kevin's calculations didn't account for thermal expansion in the custom glazing system and the windows would crack within 6 months, and by day 12 3 of the 8 homeowners had threatened to pull out with deposits in escrow and lawyers getting involved. Each message another nail in Sterling's coffin. While the lakefront mansion Vanessa promised in 90 days imploded on day 10 when the tech executive hired a forensic construction consultant to compare my timeline to Vanessa's promises. And the consultant's report was brutal, documenting that her timeline was physically impossible even with unlimited resources and perfect weather, leading to a lawsuit on day 14 filed in Cook County Circuit Court. Case number 2024 L003847, alleging fraudulent inducement, breach of contract, and negligent misrepresentation, seeking not just the return of the $800,000 deposit but $2.4 million in consequential damages for a cancelled relocation from California. And I heard through a mutual contact at the title company that Patrick had to take out a $3 million bridge loan using his personal lake house as collateral just to cover legal defense costs and potential settlement, at a 9.5% interest rate because his credit had taken a hit after Sterling missed payments to 3 suppliers. Then on day 16 the Arlington Heights commercial project, a $6.2 million office building 60% complete, ground to a halt, which hurt because I liked that client, a small growing tech company, and the project used the Echo frame system for load-bearing interior walls. But without me supervising, the framing crew installed panels in the wrong order, compromising the entire west wing, forcing the structural engineer Tom Bradshaw, who'd worked with me on 4 prior builds, to red tag the section and call me to say they'd have to tear it down and rebuild, at a cost of $340,000 plus 8 more weeks, with the client demanding Patrick cover it since it was Sterling's error, which I corrected by explaining it wasn't a design error but an installation error caused by putting an untrained architect in charge. And when Tom asked if I wanted to consult on the fix, I told him to send the contract because my rate was $200 an hour, and he hired me that afternoon. And I spent 4 days on-site supervising demolition and rebuild of the West Wing, teaching the crew proper sequencing, billing Sterling's client $9,600 plus expenses, which they happily paid because I knew what I was doing. While 2 other projects went dark when clients pulled deposits after hearing about the lawsuit, one a $4.8 million custom home in Lake Forest and the other a $3.2 million renovation in Lincoln Park, both with 15% deposits totaling $1.2 million that Patrick had already spent instead of escrowing. leading to more lawsuits, more legal bills, and more damage to Sterling's reputation. And Vanessa tried calling me 6 times in one day, leaving voicemails that started with fake apologies and ended in thinly veiled threats about jobs being at stake and blaming me when the company went under, all of which I deleted without listening through. While my consulting business thrived beyond anything I expected, starting with the first contract through Nathan Rodriguez at Apex Architecture on day 3 after I resigned, where a casual lunch in River North turned into a 3-hour meeting and Nathan laid out 6 struggling projects that all needed exactly the kind of sustainable structural solutions I'd been building for years. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you," Nathan said, pushing his plate aside and pulling out a folder full of project specs. "We've got a $12 million mixed-use development in Pilsen that stalled because we can't figure out how to meet the city's new energy efficiency requirements without blowing the budget. Your Echo Frame system would solve it. But Patrick quoted us $280,000 just for the licensing fee before you even got involved." I looked at the project specs. It was good work. Affordable housing units on the first 3 floors, commercial space on the ground level, rooftop solar installation. Exactly the kind of project that actually served communities instead of just wealthy individuals. "I'll consult on the structural design for $200 an hour, and I'll license the Echo Frame system for $35,000 plus 1.5% of the construction cost savings you realize from using it instead of traditional methods. You'll save about $180,000 in materials and 8 weeks on the timeline." Nathan didn't hesitate. "Done. When can you start?" I signed the contract that afternoon. The project became my proof of concept. Finished it in 6 weeks, came in $220,000 under their original budget projection, and the client was so happy they referred me to 3 other developers. By week 2, I had consulting contracts with 4 different firms. Apex Architecture, $47,000 contract for the Pilsen project. Morrison and Associates, $23,000 contract for structural review of a failing office renovation. Green Space Builders, $31,000 contract for sustainable residential development in Oak Park. Urban Core Development, $28,000 for commercial building redesign downtown. Revenue in just 2 weeks, $129,000, more than I'd made in 6 months at Sterling Development when you factored in all the unpaid overtime. The word spread fast in Chicago's architectural community. Turns out a lot of firms had watched Sterling Development's rise with envy, wondering how Patrick was delivering projects so efficiently. Now they knew it wasn't Patrick or Vanessa. It was the systems I developed, and suddenly those systems were available to everyone except Sterling. Week 3, I hired my first employee, Amy, my former assistant from Sterling. She'd quit the day after I left, apparently tired of watching Vanessa treat her like a personal servant. She called me crying, saying Patrick had just yelled at her for 20 minutes because nobody could find the files for the Highland Park project. The files that I'd organized and maintained and that nobody else knew the system for. "Want a job?" I asked. "Yes, please." "When?" "Tomorrow." Amy became my office manager at $55,000 per year, 15% more than Patrick had been paying her. Worth every penny because she knew my organizational systems and could hit the ground running. Week 4, I hired 2 junior architects who'd worked under me at Sterling. Both had quit voluntarily after seeing the chaos and realizing the ship was sinking. First was Kevin, the same guy Patrick had promoted to replace me, only to realize he was way over his head. Kevin called me on day 18, sounding desperate. "Jordan, I'm drowning here. Patrick's demanding I fix problems I don't even understand. Vanessa's blaming me for everything, and I'm working 90-hour weeks trying to learn systems you spent years developing. I'm done. Come work for me. $68,000 to start, 40-hour weeks, and I'll actually train you properly instead of just throwing you into the deep end." Second was Rebecca Santos, a talented architect who'd been stuck doing basic drafting work at Sterling because Vanessa kept taking credit for her design ideas. She'd been looking for an exit for months, but stayed because the market was competitive. The Sterling implosion gave her the push she needed. "I want to do meaningful work," she told me during her interview. "Not just luxury homes for people who have too much money and not enough taste. I want to design buildings that actually serve communities." That's exactly what we're doing here. When can you start? We set up a small office in West Loop, 1,200 square feet. Exposed brick, plenty of natural light, nothing fancy. Rent was $3,400 per month, which I could easily cover with just one consulting contract. Bought used furniture from an office supply liquidation sale. Got a good deal on computers and software licenses. Total startup costs, $18,000. Paid it from my savings without touching any client revenue. Month 1 revenue, $187,000 across 9 different client contracts. After expenses and payroll, $94,000 in profit. I just made more in 1 month than I used to make in a year at Sterling. And I was actually enjoying the work for the first time in years. But the real satisfaction came from watching Patrick's empire crumble. 6 weeks after I resigned, Patrick showed up at my new office. It was a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing structural calculations for a community center project. Low budget but meaningful work that would actually serve people instead of just inflating some executive's ego. My assistant buzzed me. "Jordan, there's someone here to see you. Says he's your father." I looked at the security camera feed. Patrick was standing in the lobby looking older. The arrogance that used to hold his spine straight was gone. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for too long. "Send him in," I said. He walked into my office slowly, taking in the exposed brick walls, the modern lighting, the clean efficiency of a business that was actually solvent. I didn't stand up, didn't offer him coffee or a chair, just sat behind my desk with my hands folded on top of a set of blueprints. "Vanessa's out," he said after a long silence. "I fired her this morning. She's moving to Arizona to stay with her aunt." I nodded. That seems prudent. The tech executive settlement cost me $2.8 million. Had to sell the lake house to cover it. I heard. He took a step closer, but didn't sit. "We can't finish Highland Park without the Echo Frame license. The contractors are threatening to walk. The bank is calling daily. Sounds difficult. I'm here to make you an offer, Jordan." He paused like he was delivering news that should make me jump for joy. "Come back. Not as project director, as CEO. I'll step down to chairman. You get full operational control and 51% of the voting stock. The whole company is yours." It was the offer I'd spent my 20s dreaming about, the validation I'd fought for. He was admitting I was the only one capable of running the company, and he was trying to sell me my own inheritance. "What's the catch?" I asked, my voice flat. "You license the IP back to the company. We finish the projects. We rebuild the reputation. It's a Sterling legacy, Jordan. It belongs to you." I looked at him and saw something I'd never seen before. Not a titan of industry, not even a father, just a desperate man standing in the ruins of something he destroyed, trying to trade ashes for salvation. "No," I said. He blinked. "Excuse me." The answer is no. I don't want the job. I don't want the stock. I don't want the legacy. You're being stubborn. I'm offering you everything you ever wanted. I'm admitting you were right. You won. I didn't win, Patrick. I escaped. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to the window. The Chicago skyline stretched out in front of me, full of buildings I'd helped create and buildings I'd design in the future. "You think you're offering me an empire, but you're offering me a toxic waste site. The company is damaged, the brand is compromised, and the culture is rotten. If I came back, I wouldn't be building anything. I'd spend the next decade cleaning up your mess." I turned to face him. "But that's not the real reason I'm saying no. This was the moment, the final cut. You didn't raise me, Patrick. You managed me. You treated my loyalty like a renewable resource you could exploit for profit. You demanded dedication, but offered only conditional employment. I'm your father," he whispered. "And I'm a distinct legal entity. Cutting the bloodline isn't malice. It's self-preservation. It's the only way to save yourself from being consumed by a system that sees you as a resource, not a person." I walked back to my desk and sat down. "If I come back, I accept the premise that my worth is tied to your approval. I accept that I'm a Sterling first and a person second. I reject that premise. I'm not saving the sterling name. I'm saving Jordan. He stared at me for a long time. The silence was heavy and final. He realized then that he had no leverage. Couldn't fire me. Couldn't disown me. Couldn't even guilt me because I'd closed the account. What will you do? He asked finally. With the patents, I'll license them to other firms, competitors, builders who pay their invoices and respect their architects. The Echo Frame system will build thousands of homes, Patrick. Just not yours. He nodded slowly. Didn't say goodbye. Just turned and walked out of my office, shoulders slumped, heading into a future he hadn't planned for. I watched him go through the window. Didn't feel sad. Didn't feel triumphant. Just felt clear. I turned back to my desk. The blueprints for the community center were waiting. A project that would serve actual people, built on a foundation I'd poured myself. I picked up my pencil. The line was straight. The structure was sound. And for the first time in my life, the design was entirely mine. Guys, we are so close to hit 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps hit that 100,000 mark. Thanks for making this dream come true.